All right, hello. Welcome to the Lightning Storm Druid Endgame build guide. I've been working on this one for quite some time. I'm excited to finally bring it to you. It's a lot of fun. I'm really enjoying it. It's a lot more powerful than I think people realize, and I think you're going to really enjoy playing it if you're into the playstyle that it offers, which is a ranged caster with really big AoE, lots of speed, which is very fast. Can hit things basically off screen as long as you chain into them. It's just a ton of fun. It does require a lot of gear to get it to work the way that I think it should, but it's worth the investment. So I think once people get their hands on this, it's gonna be a favorite for a lot of people, especially once you get it going in like the late end game and you pick up Umbral. You pick up a good roll of Umbral, which is you get resources when you CC, you get spirit when you CC. It just makes this build fly, and you can go without a spirit generator. So we have it set up right now on max roll. When we show the planner at the front, we're actually showing the early endgame gear. This is unusual. Normally it's the late endgame. I did that on purpose because the majority of time you'll probably be playing with a spender, or excuse me, with a generator, which will be wind shear. And I don't want to confuse people into thinking they can just pop into this and play it without a generator. If I put up the late endgame one, that's what it would look like. But the reality is, once you get a really good Umbral, you absolutely can take off, and I believe should take off your generator, and you can just fly through the dungeon and kill everything, and you'll very rarely come close to running out of spirit. And when you do, you just pop either Blood Howl and or Hurricane, and you're good. And then once Grizzly Rage comes back, you won't have any issues at all. It more than sustains itself. So this is going to be a build that I just think a ton of people are going to enjoy as much as I did. It's definitely one of my favorite builds, easily. The biggest issue is just the gear dependency. You've got to get Tempest Roar and all the Grizzly Rage aspects in order to play this really well. It needs to have the spirit cost reduction that Grizzly Rage offers, and of course the crit damage and the unstoppable are amazing as well, but that spirit cost reduction is so important for this build to be able to spam Lightning Storm. And Lightning Storm works in kind of a weird way that we can spam it really fast, but once we do, if you don't have the spirit cost reduction, yeah, it's gonna not last very long before you have to use a generator again. So really important that we get to Werewolf form as soon as we can. All right, so that's enough of me kind of rambling on about the build in general. Let's get into some of the details of this build. Let's start with the pros and cons. So the build is pretty easy to play. There's not a whole lot to it outside of using your Grizzly Rage, using Hurricane to get your Spirit Gen, using Blood Howl to also get Spirit Gen, and then you've got Cyclone Armor for some extra tankiness. The only thing that's kind of weird about it is that you don't want to hold down Lightning Storm once you build up a big Lightning Storm. You want to start to like spam attack, click it. That's a little strange, but it's not hard to do at all. It's very easy once you figure it out. It's a relatively tanky build, as are pretty much all werewolf builds at this point. It's no different. It's not the tankiest thing in the world, but it's definitely tankier than average. It's going to be pretty hard to kill you if you've got good gear. The area effect on this build is absolutely incredible. I don't know if there's anything in the game that compares. There might be. I haven't, I'm relatively limited in what I've played so far. I've been pretty much strictly Druid, but I haven't seen a lot that competes with this on area effect, especially with the range it can get. It's just crazy. And that, along with the movement speed, we can get 200% movement speed pretty easily, which is the cap. Gives us incredible clear speed, just absolutely incredible. As far as the downsides, it does have a very high gear investment, probably more than most builds. Even Druid builds already have a high gear investment because of the spirit cost reduction being so important for this build. You can play it in human form, it's just not going to feel nearly as good. So you really want to get that stuff, and then once you do, it takes off. And before that, it's going to feel a lot weaker. It's very reliant on Grizzly Rage. This is a extremely common problem for Druids. It's no different for this build. In fact, I think it's more reliant on Grizzly Rage than most builds, even Druids, or maybe every other build, because that spirit cost reduction is so important for it. You do need to stand still to charge it up. You don't need to stand still once it's charged. So the way that Lightning Storm works is when you hold it down, every time it hits, it adds another Lightning Storm attack on every time you attack with it, or like another hit, like another lightning bolt comes down up to a maximum. And once you maximize it out, You can then click instead of holding down, but you've got to get to that point, and to do so means you have to stand still, which does give it some vulnerability. It's not too bad really, because you can generally stand so far away from enemies, but it is a negative on the build. It also has inconsistent single target. By inconsistent, I mean if enemies are small, it can struggle to hit them, certainly multiple times. It's really hard for it to get a lot of consistent attacks on a small target. A large target, it doesn't struggle with. It has good single target against large targets, but you will notice sometimes you'll get stuck with a small single target by itself, and it takes a minute to, not a minute, but a bit to clear it compared to most of the time. Not a big issue, but it is a legitimate negative on the build. Okay. Let's get into the skills that we use. And again, here we're talking about the early endgame skill tree. This is where the majority of you probably will be until you get a well-rolled at least 3, preferably 4 Umbral. You're going to be using, of course, Lightning Storm as your primary damage dealer. You're going to use Wind Shear as your spirit generator. And then once you get to Umbral, you can replace that with probably Ravens. There's 3 choices here, but the default will probably be Ravens for the crit chance. But Wind Shear, until you get to that good Umbral, is going to be a must. Grizzly Rage, Direwolf's Aspect, gets you unstoppable. Of course, Aspect of the Rampaging Werebeast for critical strike damage is a very, very similar setup. If you've played Werewolf Druid before, it's pretty much always the same like this. You always have Grizzly Rage with Direwolf's Aspect to get into it, to get you the unstoppable movement speed, and then you had Rampaging Werebeast to get the massive crit damage, and then you're golden. This is no different. Blood Howl is a great heal, and also generates Spirit, which is very useful in this build. The attack speed is not useful that you could go into, so Blood Howl has the 2 options. One is Spirit Gen, one is attack speed. Interestingly enough, when you spam click Lightning Storm, it doesn't seem to get any benefit from attack speed scaling. It only does when you hold it down, and we do that very little. We want to do that as little as possible. We want to get from pack to pack within 6 seconds, so we don't lose the larger storm that we get when you do hold it down. And so you really don't want to scale something that's used very little, and so we don't actually scale attack speed on this build. It has high baseline attack speed, so it doesn't need it. Cyclone Armor is just good damage reduction and also a knockback. And Hurricane is such a good Druid skill that some people just overlook because they don't realize that masochistic benefits from it. If you crit with Hurricane, you heal. Combi before the storm somewhat benefits from it. It's not a big benefit. Hurricane does not have good lucky hit chance procs, but it does happen every once in a while. And then Aspect of the Rampaging Werebeast gets a big benefit from it, because again, every time you crit from Hurricane, you get more critical strike damage from Rampaging Werebeast on your Grizzly Rage. So that's a big part of it. As far as passives go, the big thing that confuses a lot of players with Druid is how they're applying poison to get things like Envenom, to get damage reduction while poisoned, or while the enemy's poisoned. That comes from Toxic Claws almost every time. This is no different. You use Toxic Claws to apply poison, then you get the wild poison effects, you get the Envenom crit multi, you're good to go. We are using Lupine Ferocity here as our keystone passive. This is chosen over Earth and Might so that we can use Umbral. Earth and Might's a good choice, but you will have lower Spirit sustain. It'll make the build less smooth. You can still play that way if you want to, if you don't mind using a generator instead. That's an option. I personally think that Umbral is a better choice, that most players will prefer that, and it probably will push a little bit further too, because you don't have to worry about using a generator. You can continue to stay on the damage side of it and get more healing, get all the other things you get from pushing Lightning Storm instead of pushing Wind Shear. Okay. Let's go to Spirit Boons. See, these are going to be pretty easy too. Boons are fairly standardized at this point. So actually I have to change this picture because this one is wrong. That is not in the right spot. Oh, never mind. No, that's just colored differently. I just forget this in the color. We're right. Never mind. This is good. Deer Spirit, we're going to take Wariness. Pretty much every build I think takes this right now. Reduce damage from elites. Eagle Spirit, Scythe Talon, since we're not running Earth and Might, we don't have that high crit uptime, so we need to scale our crit, and so this is a good choice. Calamity, to extend the duration of ultimate skills. This is for Grizzly Rage. We're going to be focusing Grizzly Rage hard, as do all Grizzly Rage builds. This is no different. And Snake Spirit's actually who we bond with. We're going to take Masochistic for the big heals that we get from that. Really such a strong boon. And we're also going to take, not Calamity, Calm Before the Storm, which is going to reduce the cooldown of Grizzly Rage with lucky hit chances from Storm Strike. In packs, this does happen often, and you can very often find yourself with a 2-second or less Grizzly Rage cooldown time, even sometimes having no cooldown when you get lucky, which is awesome. It's just amazing. As far as the Paragon board, let's talk about that just a little bit. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but do note that we have a starter one that you run up to about 191, and then you do a full respec after that, which is for efficiency. We gain more points when we go this route, but the starter board is in there because there are certain things that you want to prioritize early game, like the legendaries here. Like, for example, Lust for Carnage is really, really good. Gotta have it. But if we did this the regular board, it's quite a bit farther out. I think it's over here. Yeah, it's quite a bit farther out, and so you wouldn't have that for a while in the end game, and that'd be a bad idea. We don't want to do that. So we start with the starter board where we can prioritize the really important stuff, and then we go and respec later so we can maximize the efficiency of the board, gain all the possible points that we can, and really just pick up all the best stuff, and some of the stuff that we wouldn't be able to get if we didn't do that respec. As far as glyphs, we are going to use Keeper, Fulminate, Earth and Sky, Exploit, and Werewolf. Keeper is going to be a big boost to both damage and damage reduction because of where we're going to place it. We're going to get extra damage reduction from one of the rare nodes. That's also going to be the case for Earth and Sky on the magic nodes. These are just really, really strong choices. Doesn't hurt that they give you the multipliers to damage. Increase non-fizz, we're a non-fizz build. We're a lightning build, perfect. And then Earth and Sky, when you're the crowd controller are vulnerable, which is most of the time, you get 10% multiplier damage. Fulminate, also a good choice. Increased lightning damage, and then increased multiplier when healthy or injured. That's when they are above 35% health, or excuse me, above 65% health, or below 35% health. That's when healthy and injured. So most of the time that'll be up. Exploit for the vulnerable, just an excellent all-around glyph. Great for clear because it immediately applies vulnerable to them, and you have up for 3 seconds, which is enough to kill most enemies. And then Werewolf gives us some damage reduction, and then damage reduction while in werewolf form. Do note the priorities are a little bit different here from 15 to 21. That's just because some things scale the top end bonus, not the additional bonus, a little bit harder. But that additional bonus is important to get earlier on some other ones. So it's a pretty relatively small thing, but they are a little bit. So, you know, for example, Fulminate is your number 2 on 15, but to 21 Earth and Sky is your number 2. Again, not a big deal, but just bear in mind if you want to maximize your efficiency, then you have to change around your priorities just a little bit after you hit 15. Hit 15 first with all of your glyphs, and then go to 21. All your important glyphs are ones you're actually wearing. As far as gameplay, let's talk about the rotation real quick. When you're gonna go into a pack, activate Hurricane and Grizzly Rage to start it. Hurricane's gonna give you all those great things like sustain and health, and also give you crit damage. And of course, Grizzly Rage is super important. Hold down your Lightning Storm when you start to attack until you get enough actual lightning bolts at a time. I think it's like 5. I can't remember off the top of my head. It's like 5 total you can get, something like that. Once you've got that, then you can start spam clicking it instead. That's going to be actually faster than holding it down, so you definitely want to do that. It's not like you must do it. You can hold it down and it'll still be fine, but spam clicks is more damage. So I recommend spam clicking. It can feel a little rough on the wrist after a while. If that's the case, then just, you know, hold it down for a bit until your wrist recovers. But you definitely manual clicking will be better for you as far as damage. While you're in the fight, rotate between Blood Howl and Cyclone Armor to keep up Vigilance. Vigilance is damage reduction for 6 seconds after using defensive skill, and both of these are defensive tags, so they both count. Choose Cyclone Armor when you're at full spirit when you can, because it doesn't provide you spirit. Use Blood Howl when you're lower to get your spirit back up. Hurricane on cooldown or before engaging high intensity packs. Don't use it when you're, you know, traveling to a pack and you don't have anything between you. Use it when you're actually hitting enemies. Maintain maximum uptime on Grizzly Rage by staying close to enemies, so you get a few more procs, hopefully. Calm Before the Storm for Hurricane, not super important again. Hurricane doesn't have great lucky hit chance, but it's extra. So if you can do that, do that. Don't do that if it's going to get you killed. You know, don't stand too close to enemies if you can't handle it, especially if you don't have Unstoppable up. We're going to be hard CC. This build can hit practically from off screen. It can hit from off screen if you're chaining into stuff. So take advantage of range, but when you don't need the range, use Hurricane for all the benefits it has. And then, of course, if enemies get close to you, Hurricane's on, and you don't mean for them to, you'll get the benefits anyway. As far as if you're like in a tough situation, Cyclone has a knockback. Keep that in mind. Also a slow. It can get you out of stuff. And then if enemies are hitting really hard and you feel like you need extra sustain, use Blood Howl to recover from large hits instead of worrying about Spirit as much, or the defensive uptime. Use Cyclone armor instead for that. So just a more of an advanced tip there in case you actually need the sustain for health. Most of the time you'll be fine though. You have so much healing, not even including Blood Howl, that you'll be fine. As far as resource and cooldown management go, this build has like the two versions, right? It's got, when you're in early endgame, you have a low rolled umbral. You're not going to be able to sustain without wind shear. You're going to need to use wind shear from time to time. Not that often, especially when you're in Grizzly Rage. You probably won't have to use it ever. But when you fall out, sometimes you'll have to use it to get yourself some spirit. Use that with Hurricane and Blood Howl. Blood Howl and Hurricane are kind of like your priority when you can, because you get better DPS uptime. If you're using Wind Shear, you're not using Lightning Storm, so you don't want to use it when you don't have to. But use Wind Shear to fill in the gaps when you don't have enough from Hurricane or Blood Howl, or they're on cooldown. Once you get into the late end game and you actually have a high rolled umbral, 3 or 4, preferably 4, you'll also have Lust for Carnage, which you should have in the early end game as well. But the combination of umbral and Lust for Carnage will be enough, so you don't need the generator. You can take it off your bar. And the few times when you actually start to run low in Spirit, use Blood Howl, use Hurricane, and you'll be great. You'll be golden. It'll be very, very strong and very easy to play. Cooldown management is something that for most druids right now, like if you go werewolf at least, actually for most druids right now, there's a couple of exceptions. Almost most of them go Grizzly Rage, and Grizzly Rage is your cooldown management problem. You want to maintain as high uptime as possible, which is why we use Calm Before the Storm, and we're trying to proc that as much as we possibly can. We're going to do that by trying to stay close, or stay within range of packs, not necessarily close to packs, but within range of packs, so we can spam Lightning Storm, moving from packs to packs as fast as possible, which is pretty easy to do because you have very high movement speed. You can cap your movement speed on this build relatively easily. And then when it's safe to do so, you can use Hurricane to also potentially get yourself a few more procs, 1 or 2 more procs of Calm Before the Storm. If you do this efficiently, you will have low cooldown time on Grizzly Rage, and you'll have very, very high uptime. And you won't have to worry about CC very much, and you'll have really high damage. So this is like your big thing that you're trying to manage. You're trying to get your Grizzly Rage to be as high uptime as possible, which you can get to be very high, not quite 100%, but pretty close to that. All right, as far as gear, I'm not going to go into too much detail here. You can see all the aspects these are all the aspects that we use for not just like the end game setup, but the other setups that you're going to need for your codex. And then we've got a couple of things that you have to have that you farm through the world: Direwolves and Lightning Dancers. You can't get those through the codex. And then Tempest Roar is something that you're going to really, really want. It's not technically a need. You technically can play in human form, but it's just it's night and day when you have Tempest Roar. You want to get this as fast as possible. Now that Helltides can drop uniques, that's becoming a viable option to target farm this through the helmet and the mysteries chest. So bear that in mind. That could be a good choice now, along with Nightmare Dungeons, to farm your Tempest Roar. And Mad Will's Glyphs for speed farming, the speed farming variant. I play this pretty much consistently as speed farming right now. So I actually wear Mad Will's Glyph most of the time, if not all the time. So this is a really good unique for that. Just bear in mind that once you start to do difficult content, you're going to want to take this off because you're losing a lot of damage reduction from it for a decent bit, but not a crazy amount of damage. So not necessary here, but a nice boost to your performance, both movement speed wise and damage wise. As far as the progression steps, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I do want to point out a few things. The starter setup is assuming that you don't have Tempest Strike, so it's assuming that you're going to be in human form. This is not an ideal setup, but some people are going to want to play Lightning Storm early, and this lets you do that. You're going to have a lot of spirit, not issues, but you're not going to be able to spam it as much as you can with a Grizzly Rage setup. So do bear in mind that if you decide to play this in human form, it's not going to feel the same. Don't judge it based upon the human form version. You've got to get to the Grizzly Rage version for it really to shine. But this will get you there. It gets you Earthen Bulwark, which gets you unstoppable. So it mostly fills in a lot of the gaps here, except for the fact that you're not going to have as good spam ability. But we still are using a low roll Umbral in this case, because you can get a Codex version of Umbral. It's just one primary. In my opinion, it's still worth it to do that. And so you can still play it fairly efficiently. It's just going to be, you know, it's not going to be the same. Early endgame, we're already transitioning into Tempest Roar. I don't see any reason to try to make another human version on this when this is really where we want to be. You're really trying to get to that Tempest Roar. That is your #1 priority, and then the Grizzly Rage stuff along with it. At this point, you're going to shift into the Grizzly Rage version of the build, and then things are going to really take off. Late endgame, the big difference here is going to be that you got a high rolled Umbral now versus early endgame. We still have the 1 point rolled Umbral. We're assuming that it's a hard thing to get. Like, it's pretty rare to get a high rolled Umbral. I have one. I just happen to have a 4. So it's going to be hard to get this, but once you do, that's when you go to late endgame. And then the big difference is you can now take off Wind Shear. You can keep Wind Shear, by the way, if like you're really skittish about it. I still would use Umbral. But you don't need it anymore, and so you can replace it with something like Ravens, which gives you a little bit of crit strike on a single target. There's not like a great option here to replace Wind Shear, but there are gains to be made. Ravens increase crit strike. You can go Wolves to get some Fortify, or you can go Earth and Bulwark as an emergency unstoppable source if you're out of Grizzly Rage. All three of those are choices here. We go Ravens for the additional damage. I think that's all I need to talk about. On the progression setups right now, gameplay does change a little bit between them. I'm going to let you guys go ahead and read that, though, because there's no point in going through every single one here, because you're going to be on one or the other. All three of them is kind of like overkill for this video guide. The last couple of sections here, let's talk about. So build scaling. Critical strikes are critical strike chances pretty high in this build. It's not 100%, but Lupine Frosty gives us some, plus other crit strikes from our gear and also from our boon. Critical strike damage is going to be primarily handled through Grizzly Rage and Rampaging Werebeast, which is just super strong. It's going to be awesome. You get so much damage from it. Vulnerable is amazing. We're going to get our vulnerable procs from Exploit, Natural Hurricane, and Elemental Exposure, which is not as consistent as some other builds. Like, for example, Stormclaw can have like practically 100% uptime because it can use it through Storm Strike, but this is still pretty high uptime and definitely worth scaling vulnerable because of it. The Envenom Festering type setup with the poison stuff. Remember, you need Toxic Claws to run that. 1 point in Toxic Claws enough, and you're golden. You don't have to worry about anything crazy about it. That's all you need. Cooldown reduction, we get a lot from this setup, which is great for our Grizzly Rage uptime, which is why we run a one-hander versus a two-hander to get the additional 25% or so cooldown from that. As far as defenses, we got a ton of healing from this build. We're actually building a ton of armor as well because we are using Disobedience. It does look like, from what the scuttlebutt, so to speak, is right now, it looks like there's a pretty high cap on armor, especially at high levels of Nightmare. So Disobedience fits in well here and should scale really well, along with Iron Claw and the Paragon nodes. As far as defensive multipliers, we don't get a ton from off gear. We really get only Vigorous. But you still get a ton from your gear, so we have a lot of defensive reduction multipliers, which are a very important part of your defenses, so do not overlook those. Venom Wall is another thing that benefits from Toxic Claws. This is the damage reduction from enemies that are poisoned. Definitely want to have Toxic Claws running with this, and you should have it anyway, so it's not a problem. Fortify, we get a lot of Fortify from Grizzly Rage. We can take advantage of that for damage reduction while fortified. We already talked about Cyclone Armor and Hurricane, what they generally offer. We can take on Hurricane, Savage Hurricane, and deal 20% less, or for enemies affected, dealing 20% less damage. This might be something that you want to consider if you're going to push high Nightmare dungeons. However, bear in mind that you lose a considerable source of vulnerable damage if you do that. So in this setup, we are running Natural Hurricane, but it is an option if you want to think about it. As far as stat priorities and gear options, I'm not going to run through every single thing here. Let's just go through a couple of points. Helmet, body armor, pants. As far as gems go, we're going Royal Ruby here. I'm probably going to change over all my builds to Ruby from, I think it's Sapphire. I think Sapphire is the one. It's damage reduction while fortified. When we run the EHP calcs, Royal Ruby keeps coming back slightly better. It's not a huge difference. We could run either and be fine, but Ruby does seem to somewhat outperform Sapphire. So I'm probably going to switch to that. Weapon offhand, Royal Emerald, not a huge benefit here, but there's not a ton you can get out of it. You get extra crit on vulnerable enemies, excuse me, so that's good. Royal Skulls and Jewelry is pretty much like best in slot for every single build. Doesn't seem to be any variation on this, any disagreement that we just run this because resistance are terrible. As far as Liches and Incense, not super important. I generally don't run with any of these because they're expensive, but these are the best ones if you want to push Nightmare Dungeons, which is when you most likely use those. Okay, as far as stat priorities go, we already should know the aspects and whatnot from the planner, but here's a list of how you can set them up, including which ones can be swapped for what areas. Stat priorities, things you're going to be looking for generally are vulnerable damage. You're going to be looking for critical strike chance. Damage reduction sources are going to be really big generally throughout this. Cooldown reduction is huge. It's going to be probably number one just about everywhere it's on here. I think it is. I think it's number one everywhere. All the damage reduction sources again. Armor and Werewolf on boots is really, really good. We don't put it on Amulet because Amulet's just like it's got so many good things on it. I think it's Amulet that can wear it, right? Yeah. We're going cooldown reduction, move speed, and venom, and then one of the damage reduction sources, preferably poisoned or fortified. Yeah, crit strike chance on rings is number 2 to vulnerable. Those are really, really close together, honestly. Maximum life is only on rings. If you haven't seen some of my stuff on this before, maximum life on gear doesn't scale with increases to health like the ruby rings or the ruby gems, excuse me. It doesn't scale at all with us. I don't know why. Like, I know why in the code it doesn't, but I don't know why Blizzard set up that way, but they did, which makes it a lot weaker than you'd expect, which is why you see it like lower on priority on, like, for example, chest. It's number 7. That's really low. That's why it's just not as good as it should be. So rings, there's nothing to really compete with it, so we put it on rings. Hardcore adjustments, there's not a ton to change here. I would take Earthen Bulwark over Ravens to get the emergency unstoppable, so I don't get stuck in a hard CC, maybe not paying attention or just getting unlucky. Damage reduction on an Amulet over Envenom isn't an option here also. It's about something like 24% damage lost if you do that, but it might save your life. That's a personal choice. I would suggest taking Ghostwalker over Stormshifters, though, as this is a clear hardcore value to be able to, not necessarily the move speed, which is good, but you might be move speed capped anyway. Be able to move freely through enemies is a pretty big deal because you can definitely get stuck in large packs if you don't have it. All right, as far as endgame variants go, we're not going to go through too much detail. There's not really, honestly, too much detail here anyway. Speed farming, Mad Wolf Scully add that. And movement speed after killing an enemy on boots. If you aren't already move speed capped, which you very well may be, and if so, just skip that and go with a regular setup. Skill tree, we don't make much change here either. We take 1 point out of defensive posture and we put into brutal ravens just to get a little bit extra crit chance on some more enemies. Tiny change, not really going to change much here. If you want to push it for even more damage and you are comfortable with your healing just from Circle of Life, you can take Overload over Masochist. Do test this and make sure you can actually handle that. If you're running low speed farming stuff, especially like Helltide, this should be no problem at all. But if you're running like mid-tier Nightmare Dungeons, it might not be enough healing. Just something to think about. As far as Nightmare Dungeon pushing, there's not a ton of changes here either, but there are a few to think about. Ghostwalker over Shifters for the avoiding the trap. Just that's similar to the hardcore setup. No difference really here between those two. On your Amulet, damage reduction while fortified over either move speed or ranks 2 in Venom. I think it's probably should be in Venom unless you can cap out with movement speed. Or if, excuse me, in case you can, I am wording this horribly. If you can avoid the telegraphs, go with Envenom. If you can't avoid the telegraphs, go with movement speed as far as what you keep. So replace movement speed if you can still get out of everything just fine. Otherwise, keep it and replace Envenom if you want the extra damage reduction. It might be the case that you don't want to make this change if you feel like you want to try to kill stuff before it can get to you. But this is an option for you. That's an area where you could potentially gain if you can get additional damage reduction that can push you a little bit farther. As far as the skill tree goes, this is similar to the hardcore thing. Take out Ravens, put in Earthen Bulwark, get the Unstoppable Emergency in case Grizzly Rage is on cooldown. Yeah, not much change in the gameplay either. Pinnacle Boss, let's open this with a couple of caveats. First off, the Pinnacle Boss is Uber Lilith or Echoes of Lilith. Very few people still have killed that. Very few builds have done it, certainly ethically, quote unquote, without bugs. And so the meta of what it takes to kill this boss is still evolving. One thing we do know is that you want high single target damage. This is not a high single target build, so it very well may be nearly impossible to kill her with it. It's hard to say yet. Not many people, I haven't seen anybody push for this build yet. Try to do Uber Lilith. I haven't seen that yet. It's going to happen at some point. Someone's going to try it, but I have not seen it yet. So I also haven't killed it or tried it with this. So these suggestions, take them with a grain of salt. They're just ideas, suggestions that you could try if you want to attempt that on this build. They might not be the best choices. You're probably going to have to experiment. And even that might not be enough to be determined. As far as some things you can do, though, replace Lightning Dancers with Edge Masters. Lightning Dancers is really good for a clear, but it might not even hit on Lilith. It's hard to say whether those bolts would hit her because she does have a large hitbox, but it's not clear. But we do know Edge Masters will work. That's a 20% increase in damage if you're at full spirit, which you should be that or near that when you are in Grisly Rage. Take dodge chance over movement speed after killing elite. This is a pretty safe choice, and honestly, I think we actually switched out movement speed after killing elite on a lot of the stuff here because you can get to cap without it, so it might not even be a change you need to make. As long as you can still avoid the telegraphed attacks, consider taking damage reduction while fortified over movement speed on the amulet. This is, it could go either way, really. Whether or not you need the movement speed to get out of the telegraphs, because it is a telegraph heavy fight, or whether or not the damage reduction will help save you. It's gonna be experimental. That's just where we're at with that fight right now. As far as the skill tree, you can stick with Ravens for the increase in critical strike chance. I do have some concern that this might be one of the few times where not having a generator might cause you to run a spirit, because it is a extended fight in single target. If that happens, just switch to wind shear. Very, very simple switch, and you'll be fine. You can just use wind shear when you need to. All right. The last two sections we'll talk about here, the frequently asked questions. Why not Mad Wolf's Glee? We are using it. We're just going to use it in speed farming. As for like general stuff, especially like Nightmare, dungeon pushing, we don't use it because it's got really bad DR. But any content that you can handle without the DR, run Mad Wolf's Glee. Why not Temerity? It's an HP loss. It's a lot. It's a lot worse than a good set of rare pants than with Vigorous or Disobedience on them. So legendary pants with Vigorous, it's just way better. It's so much better. So don't run Temerity. It's just not worth it. Why Lupine Frosty over Earth and Might? This is something that internally we've had a lot of discussion about. Which one is better? I believe Lupine Frosty is better because of Umbral. So I think this is the best choice, but Earth and Might is a good choice if you'd rather have a higher crit uptime and are willing to use a generator. But do bear in mind that Earth and Might will almost never go off on a single target, which to me puts Lupine Frosty further in favor here. But Earth and Might is considered a totally viable strategy for this build, and I agree it is a totally viable. I personally think the Umbral setup is much better, but if you feel like you'd rather have a higher crit uptime on clear and are willing to use a generator when needed, absolutely go for it. It's not like the wrong choice, so to speak. I personally think Frosty is going to end up being considered the best choice in the end. Okay, last thing on mechanics. There's not a ton of mechanics to talk about on this build. One thing I did want to point out, though, is you have Overcharged and Lightning Dancers in this, which are sub skills, and you might be like, well, why don't you just scale, more damage? A couple of reasons for that. One are these have high base damage, and so they do a lot of damage, especially on clear. Like they're really, really, really good on clear. So they're just a ton of damage for clear. But also there's not a lot of good options to even compare to these. The one that we might use is Edge Master's Aspect, but Edge Masters is only 20% damage when you're at full spirit, which you're going to be at a good bit in Grisly Rage, so it's not a terrible idea. But I think the only time Edge Masters is actually going to win out damage-wise over Overcharge or Lightning Dancers would be single target, and that's mostly because Lightning Dancers won't even hit, and Overcharge does require lucky hit, so it's not going to proc as much. So that would be one change you can make. But our single target is good enough without that under the vast majority of cases, I would not want to make this switch, because you're going to actually lower your clear time in especially Nightmare Dungeons or really in any content by going Edge Masters. So I think you should go the two sub skills. However, if you are more comfortable with Edge Masters and just seeing the bigger damage on the Lightning Storm strikes, that's absolutely fine. It's still a viable option as well. Okay, that will do it for this build guide. Thank you so much for hanging in there. 35 minutes. It's a long one. I hope you really enjoy this guide or this build. I personally I love it. I do. I think it's a great build. I think you're going to have a great time with it. Let me know how you feel about it in the comments. Let me know how it's working for you. Have a great rest of your time or a great time in Diablo 4, and I will see you all again real soon.